For most of his life, Robert Irwin has existed in a strange kind of spotlight. Famous not for something he did, but for who his father was. The cameras loved him from the start, a small boy grinning next to crocodiles, utterly unbothered by danger that would send most adults running. What those early clips couldn't show was a quieter reality underneath. A child growing up in the shadow of a man he barely got the chance to know. Terri Irwin has talked about those years only in pieces, over many interviews, always guarded, always protective of her children. She's described the period after Steve's death as one of the hardest stretches of her life. Learning to run a zoo, raise 2 kids in full public view, and simply keep going all at once. But she's also said that from very early on, Robert wasn't just tagging along. There was something in him, even as a toddler, that struck her as different. He didn't just tolerate being around animals. He engaged with them the way Steve had, fearlessly, instinctively, without the hesitation most people carry. By age 4, Robert was already appearing on television alongside his mother and sister, and audiences began noticing what Terri had privately observed for years. It wasn't a child performing for a camera. It was something that looked, to a lot of people, like more than mimicry. There's a particular kind of disorientation that comes with raising the child of someone who died young, and in the public eye, watching that child slowly start to resemble them. Not metaphorically, but in ways that catch you off guard mid-sentence. Terri has spoken about moments like this across several interviews. Robert tilting his head a certain way, lighting up while talking about a creature, and suddenly the line between past and present blurring. She's described those moments as carrying joy and grief together. So tightly wound they're hard to separate. The resemblance wasn't only in mannerisms. As Robert moved through his teenage years, longtime fans of the family began remarking on the physical likeness too. The build, the on-camera energy, the same total ease around animals that unsettles trained professionals. People who'd grown up on Steve's original series said watching Robert felt like watching a younger version of the Crocodile Hunter. Not as an act, but as something that seemed to run in the blood. By 2024, Robert had started speaking publicly about his father with a level of emotional depth that surprised people. He talked about what it meant to grow up understanding that his father had shaped an entire generation's relationship with wildlife, not just his own family's. He described feeling lucky, but in a way that suggested he'd actually wrestled with that feeling rather than simply repeating it. For Terri, hearing her son articulate that kind of perspective at his age was, by her own description, another moment where pride and grief arrived together. There was an easier path available to Robert. Coast on the family name. Show up, be pleasant, keep the brand alive. Nobody would have faulted him for taking it. Instead, he built a body of work that was distinctly his own while still honoring what came before. In his early teens, he became a recurring guest on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, bringing exotic animals into the studio and handling them with a composure that consistently impressed audiences. He wasn't playing a character or leaning on his surname. He came across as genuinely knowledgeable, genuinely funny, and genuinely invested in conservation as something lived rather than performed. He also became a serious wildlife photographer, with work shown in galleries internationally. In 2020, he won a major wildlife photography award for an image of an Australian forest devastated by bushfire, a photograph that read less like documentation and more like an argument, quietly making the case for why any of it mattered. Then came Dancing with the Stars. Robert joined season 34 of the American Competition series, and what followed became one of the more emotionally resonant runs the show had produced in years. At 21, dancing in front of millions for the first time, he managed to be both fully himself and genuinely unpredictable. Stepping, many observers noted, out of the frame the public had built around him since childhood. He wasn't Steve's son on that stage. He was simply Robert Irwin. His conservation advocacy followed the same pattern. Rather than leaning on nostalgia for his father, he built his message around data, habitat loss, disappearing species, urgency backed by his own photography. He wasn't asking people to care because Steve had. He was showing them what was being lost and asking what they intended to do about it. On October 14th, 2025, Dancing with the Stars aired what it called Dedication Night, where each remaining contestant performed for someone who had shaped their life. Robert chose his mother. In the video package before his performance, he struggled to get through his explanation of what Terri meant to him. He talked about losing his father at 2 years old, and about coming to understand as he got older what that period must have actually demanded of her, running a zoo, raising 2 children publicly, holding together a global legacy, while personally devastated. He said that at every major milestone where he found himself missing his father, Terri had been there instead, and that had been enough. He barely made it through the sentence. Terri, watching from the audience, was already in tears before the music started. The routine that followed was built around that relationship, what it costs a parent to carry that much, and what it means to a child who watched her do it. When it ended, Robert walked straight into Terri's arms. His sister Bindi joined them, and the three held each other as a room went quiet before erupting into applause. The judges were visibly moved. One remarked that Steve would have been watching and smiling. Another, who had partnered Bindi during her own season a decade earlier, couldn't finish his comments through tears. Afterward, Terri described the night the way she tends to describe things that are hard to put into words, by focusing on what she'd observed rather than what she'd felt. She said it felt like seeing Steve again, while also being unmistakably, completely Robert. She said she'll always hold on to that night, and that her son was not only a talented dancer, but a genuinely good person. That wasn't the only emotional performance of the season. On November 11th, the anniversary of Steve's death, Robert and Bindi danced a foxtrot to a song she had once used to honor their father in her own season a decade prior, with childhood footage of Robert and Steve playing across the ballroom. Robert finished in tears. The judges awarded a perfect score. In the days after, he said publicly that carrying his father's legacy didn't feel like a burden but a direction, that he felt his father present in everything he did. By the November 25th, 2025 finale, the conversation around Robert had shifted. He was no longer being discussed primarily as Steve Irwin's son, doing well on a reality show. He'd become the story in his own right. The stakes were raised further by news that surfaced just before the finale. Robert had been dancing through a significant intercostal muscle strain for weeks, quietly pushing through pain rather than making it a headline. When asked about it, he described it not as a sacrifice, but simply as a choice, one shaped, it seemed, by growing up watching his mother absorb far more than she should have had to, and keep going anyway. On finale night, Robert and his partner delivered 3 routines, building to a freestyle that earned a standing ovation before scores were even read, with one judge calling it a near-perfect performance without exaggeration. The evening drew one of the show's most engaged audiences in years, with tens of millions of votes cast. When the results came in, Robert Irwin was named season 34 champion, joining his sister Bindi in the show's winners' circle exactly a decade after her own victory. In interviews following the win, Robert spoke about his mother with a candor that seemed to catch even the interviewer off guard. He described what she had done after Steve's death, keeping the zoo running, raising 2 children under constant public scrutiny, sustaining a global conservation mission while grieving, and said he became emotional just considering what it had actually cost her. He said the world had underestimated her from the start, and that recognizing what she'd carried and saying so publicly felt like the most meaningful part of everything he'd accomplished that year, more than the trophy, more than photography awards, more than any single television appearance. Steve Irwin reportedly once said, in footage Robert has since described as difficult to watch, that his ultimate goal was to eventually step back and let the next generation carry the mission forward. That reaching that point would mean he'd succeeded. He never got the chance. He was 44 when he died. Robert was 2. The responsibility fell to Terri, a zoo to run, 2 children to raise, and a global audience watching to see what would happen next. What happened, nearly 2 decades later, was a 21-year-old standing in a ballroom with a trophy, speaking about his mother with a kind,